Welcome back to Gaming with Spoons. In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a Final Fantasy tier list and placing the games in order on this tier list where I think they should be placed, talking my way through it and letting you guys know the reasoning behind my decisions. Final Fantasy, despite some of the problems that I've had with some of the more modern entries, it is still a series that really resonates with me. It is the reason that I am into RPGs to begin with, and really the reason my YouTube channel pretty much exists. So I do owe a lot to Final Fantasy, despite some frustration that I do have with the franchise. That being said, let's dive right in and start taking a look at some of these games. So the first game up is Final Fantasy 15. Oh, Final Fantasy 15, I'm going to put you in, I think I'm going to put you in C tier. There are things about Final Fantasy 15 I like. I do like its characters quite a bit, especially the four main protagonists, Gladio, Prompto, Ignis, and Noctis. There are elements to its story that I like, but there's a lot about the game that I don't like. While some of its elements of its combat are fun, the combat kind of feels repetitive. It kind of feels like it needed more time to be worked out. I found the open world aspects of the game very bland, especially when it came to the side quests and how they were able to incorporate those into the story. The story as a whole, though those elements of it I like, just felt like it was mixed up across far too much media, and just overall, every complaint that I have about Final Fantasy 15 could have been fixed had the game just had more development time. And I feel like a lot of the game's problems came from Square Enix's upper management and not letting the project come to fruition. It's a shame, because there's a lot about Final Fantasy 15 that I do enjoy, but there's a lot that pushes it way, way down the list on what I consider a top-tier Final Fantasy game. Next up on the list is another controversial title within the franchise, and if I'm being fair, I think that this belongs in... I'm going to put this in B tier. I feel like Final Fantasy 13 gets a lot of hate that it does not deserve. It does have its problems. It's very linear. Most of its story feels like one giant tutorial. It takes forever for the game to open up. The progression path is also very linear in those regards. The story is put behind data logs, but what is there is really interesting. I also like the characters. I'm not going to say that they are my favorite cast within Final Fantasy, but they are a cast that I find myself enjoying quite a bit. Final Fantasy 13 is not as bad a game as many make it out to be, and I do find enjoyment out of that game, despite it having some flaws. Let's take a look at Final Fantasy XII, Revenant Wings. This is a hard game for me to place, because on one hand, Revenant Wings has a really, really grand story. I really enjoyed this game's story quite a bit, but on another hand, it's an RTS, and I'm not a fan of RTS. This is going to be a very biased pick for me. I think depending on your love for RTSs, you're going to place this onto this tier list very differently. But for me, Revenant Wings is a D tier. This is a one-and-done game. I'm not going to review this game at all for the channel. I might make a video talking about some of the story elements, catching up a little bit through it, through Let's Plays and things like that, reading it up on the internet, but I don't ever see myself reviewing this for the channel. It was a slog to get through the first time, and it was a slog to get through, and I don't want to do it a second time. So Final Fantasy XII Revenant Wings is a D tier. Again, it is a good game. It's just RTSs are not my type of thing, and I realize that there is a lot of bias coming from that placement. That being said, let's take a look at Dissidia Duodecim. I am going to place this in B tier. B tier, I think it is a good game. I don't think they added a whole lot to really necessarily justify making a sequel. I feel like that they could have just added additional DLC to the game and called that good. One thing that is great about Duodecim is it also does have the original Dissidia campaign in there as well after you finish up Duodecim. But again, it's it's a nostalgia thing too. I have and we'll get to Dissidia, the original Dissidia, here in a little bit, but I mean, I enjoyed it for what it was. I thought it was a solid game, and you know, it does its job and it works. It's just we'll talk about Dissidia here in a little bit. Final Fantasy 12. I am putting this right up here in S tier. Let's go A tier. A tier, Final Fantasy 12 is another game that I feel gets a lot of unjustified hate. The game in of itself is not bad. A lot of people say it doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy, it's too dark to be a Final Fantasy, its plot is too mature to be a Final Fantasy, its world, it's a lot of things it explores, it's very political, and that's a lot of what I enjoyed about it. It takes place in the world of Ivalice, and that's the reason I enjoy it. I enjoy that dark, gritty nature that the game has. That story of the story behind it. It's just the villain is actually really, really good. And I'm looking forward to reviewing this game again for the channel because there's a lot I have to say about this game that I don't think a lot of other people have said. So Final Fantasy XII is in my top 5 Final Fantasies. I absolutely adore this video game. I think it is a tried and true gem. I really enjoyed this game, and despite my first time through the game, or really the first time I tried to play the game, not liking it, once I sat down and gave this game a go, I really fell in love with it. So yeah, it's one of those games that if you didn't like the first time, I say give it another shot. Highly recommended. Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core. I'm going to put this in A tier. Final Fantasy Crisis Core, I feel like you either love it or you hate it, and I'm in the camp that loves it. There was a lot that this game did that I truly enjoyed. I enjoyed a lot of its characters. I enjoyed the backstory that we got from Zack. I enjoyed the story as a whole. I enjoyed how it tied into Final Fantasy VII. There were some complaints that I did have with the game, but that was the limitations more of the hardware. I feel like that this would have been better suited for the PlayStation 3 or the PlayStation 2. I feel like they could have done more with the game as a whole rather than putting it on a portable system. But overall, I found this game to be very satisfactory. There's a lot of elements to this I really like. The music is really top-notch, especially when it comes to titles such as The Price of Freedom. An absolute beautiful song. I can't say too much more without spoiling its story, but it's definitely a game that I recommend playing. Alrighty, next up, Final Fantasy VII Dirge of Cerberus. I'm placing this in C tier. There are elements to this game I like. I don't think it is as bad of a game as people try to make it out to be, which is why it's not going into D tier. It definitely feels a bit jumbled when it comes to its story, but I enjoyed the backstory that Vincent got. Being a big Vincent fan myself, it was really nice to be able to see a lot of his character progression and bit of backstory and kind of relationship between him, Lucrezia, and Hojo, and getting more explanation on that. There were some retcons to the original Final Fantasy VII that I didn't enjoy, and again, the gameplay wasn't by any means amazing, but what was there I did find myself enjoying. Dissidia Nt. This is a D tier. Hands down, absolutely horrible, horrible game. I did not enjoy this game in the slightest. This game was... It took everything that made the first 2 Dissidia games great, threw it out the window, and tried to make this a giant cash grab. I realized that this was a port of an arcade, but even the game felt like it was going to add, at some point, loot boxes and microtransactions, and the way that you unlocked characters, the way that the story progressed. It was an absolute mess. It was a shame, because I so badly wanted to see Dissidia come to PlayStation 4 and be able to get that same love, care, and passion that the original games had, and Square Enix just didn't deliver. Dissidia is an A tier. I realize this is pretty high ranking for a Final Fantasy fighting game, but it is the memories really that I have playing this game. I have a friend I remember sitting down and playing this game hours upon end with. I remember going through the sections, the different areas in the story, and talking about it, having fun, playing versus mode with him, and just the overall memories I have of this game really place this game higher on a tier list than what it deserves to be. But those memories are always going to be something that I really cherish and care for. The controls were smooth. I really enjoyed it for the most part. I feel like it fulfilled that brawler, that fighting game I always wanted to see Final Fantasy go for. So I walked away pretty satisfied. Oh, Final Fantasy VII Remake. This is a conflicting title for me. There are elements about this game that I really enjoyed, and there are elements about this game I really despised. Before I even attempt to put this in a playlist, or tier list, let's walk through some of the things I liked, some of the things I didn't. Final Fantasy VII Remake, for me, nailed certain elements of the story. It really paid homage to a lot of the some of the earlier elements of Final Fantasy VII's story. It really did very, very well with its characters and expanding upon the characters more. Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie got a lot more screen time, especially when it came to fleshing out Jessie's backstory a lot more. There was really a lot that I appreciated there. The world felt more lived in and more built upon. Wall Market was done very, very well. I really liked the added elements that they put into Wall Market. However, if we're talking about the story, the way that they handled the ending, really the last 2.5 chapters of the game, it really started to fall apart for me. I was not a fan of the plot twist at the end. I didn't like the certain elements they put in towards the end of the game. It was a big letdown for me when it came to the finale of the game. I'm still playing Remake Part 2, but I am skeptic how that's going to turn out. Strictly from a gameplay perspective, though, this is an S-tier game. Final Fantasy VII Remake, hands down, has one of the most amazing combat systems Square Enix has crafted in modern age. It took everything great from Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV, really I'd say Kingdom Hearts, meshed them together and created this beautiful, flowing game. The game can be a bit linear at times, but we're not talking about Final Fantasy XIII linear. I really enjoyed the music to the game. Again, this is really hard for me to place. I'm going to place this in B tier, a high B tier. It is slightly above Final Fantasy XIII for me in terms of quality, but there's a lot with this story that's just making it so I cannot put this in A tier. I feel like B tier is a rather solid place to put the Final Fantasy VII Remake, because if anything, one of the main reasons I want to play the Final Fantasy VII Remake is for more of that gameplay. There was something so satisfying about that game's gameplay, despite some of the areas feeling a lot more prolonged than they needed to be. Next up is Final Fantasy VIII, another title I feel a lot of people either love or a lot of people hate, especially when it comes to the PlayStation 1 titles. Me personally, Final Fantasy VIII is a game that I love. There's a lot about this game that I enjoy. This is an A tier for me. From its characters, to its story, to its gameplay, I think it's a very solid game. There are some things with its gameplay that I don't exactly like. I'm not the biggest fan of the drawing system, but I get what Square Enix was trying to do with that. I personally enjoyed the junction system. There were some other design elements I feel like Square Enix could have done a better job with. But overall, Final Fantasy VIII was a very satisfactory experience for me. And, I don't hate it like other people do. I look actually forward. This is another one of those games I look forward to reviewing because I have a lot to say about it. So look forward to that in the near future. Probably 2022 when Final Fantasy turns 35 years old. Let's get into Final Fantasy IX. Longtime subscribers of the channel will know my love for this game. This is an S tier for me. Final Fantasy IX remains to this day my favorite Final Fantasy. My first Final Fantasy, the game that got me into Japanese RPGs. The whole reason this channel exists is because of Final Fantasy IX. Had I not played that game back when I was 12 years old, I would have not fallen in love with the franchise like I did. This game, I owe pretty much everything I have played within the past 20 years to. This game is absolutely amazing. So, Final Fantasy IX, thank you so much for all of the fond memories. I absolutely love it. Story's great, characters are great, the world's great, the character building, the world design. There's not a whole lot that I don't like about this game, maybe save for Amaranth and Quina. But even some of the side characters, like Beatrix, are so compelling. There's a lot more about this game I wish we would still get to know to this day. I would love to see Hironobu Sakaguchi return, flesh out this game's story more, and kind of give this a remake like Final Fantasy VII had, but, you know, flesh out that detail a little bit. And I feel like bringing Sakaguchi back on board and having him write the story, it would progress out a lot more like the original did, rather than taking liberties like Final Fantasy VII Remake's story did. Next up on this list is another game that either people love or people hate. Me personally, I do not hate this game. I am going to put this in B tier. Final Fantasy X-2. I feel like Final Fantasy X-2 is either, again, you love it or you hate it. There's a lot that's good about this game, there's a lot that's bad about this game. And it kind of depends on preference and subjectivity as to what you think is good and bad. A lot of the writing is very melodramatic. I feel like this was kind of that first step into the Motoi Toriyama, is it? The guy who directed Final Fantasy XIII, kind of his first step into understanding what he thought Final Fantasy should be. Again, there's some very charming elements to it. It was nice to see kind of Spira in this post-Sin world after Sin was gone. There was a lot that I enjoyed within this game. There's a lot that I didn't enjoy. Overall, it was a decent experience, but not one that I would necessarily recommend or gush about, or even really remember a whole lot for that point. When I do review Final Fantasy, it is going to be the mainline series first, and then I may go back in and take a look at some of the spin-offs that I really enjoyed. And I will put X-2 in there because I do have a lot I want to say, and I want a chance to revisit that title. Final Fantasy X. Now, Final Fantasy X is a whole different ballpark. This is an S-tier game. Final Fantasy X does so much right, from its story to its beautiful scenery, to its amazing music, to its characters, and the revelations that the game reveals. The ending was absolutely beautiful. It was sad, it was heart-wrenching, and that's part of the reason I had a problem with Final Fantasy X-2, because it took everything that I enjoyed about that ending, and it either kept the ending or didn't keep the ending, depending on the choices you made. But if we're going from complete canon, 2.5, and the audio drama, we know how that ending played out and what happened at the end of X-2, and it just kind of felt like a slap in the face to Final Fantasy X. But its combat system was very traditional based. I enjoyed being able to switch out party members. There was a lot of strategy when it came to its battle system. I really enjoyed Final Fantasy X as a whole. There are a lot of late game ways to start cheesing the system and make your character super overpowered, which is a bit of a shame if you decide to do that, but that's wholly up to you. I feel like it takes away a lot of those strategy elements that made the initial first end of the game, or first game, part of the game, so unique. But other than that, Final Fantasy X, such an amazing experience. One of my favorite stories within the franchise. Next up is Final Fantasy IV: The After Years. This is a D tier. This has no right existing. This is not a good game. I don't enjoy it. It is a complete slap in the face to everybody who played the original Final Fantasy IV. It is a complete repeat of the same events that happened in Final Fantasy IV, only to characters you love. And it felt like a big, again, slap in the face to fans. I don't know what it is with Square Enix having to make sequels to games and repeating some of the same stories, or doing a disservice to the original. It's like Disney and their direct-to-DVD sequels. They just seem to not be able to get certain things right when it comes to doing sequels. At least 10-2 pays respect to a lot of the characters and tries to be original. Final Fantasy IV just feels like they were trying to capitalize off of nostalgia, and completely and utterly failed. The gameplay feels fine. I don't have a problem with the gameplay, but I have a problem with its episodic structure, and because of this, the difficulty fluctuates way too much. This is a game I haven't finished. Yes, I will be diving in and taking a look at it at some point on the channel, but it's not going to be for quite a while. Final Fantasy III for me, I'm going to place this in C tier. It was a product of its time. Final Fantasy III was a solid game, but there's been so much evolution for the series over time that I feel like Final Fantasy III is just alright. It's not great, it's not grand, it's not amazing. It was amazing back in the day, but again, like I said, so many other Final Fantasies have come out, it's kind of lost a lot of what made its charm. It was the early setup for class-based systems. I thoroughly enjoyed that. I thought they did an excellent job with that. The story was alright for the time. The characters just kind of existed. There are elements to Final Fantasy III I do enjoy. But I'm not overly crazy about it, because as time has gone on, the stories have gotten better, the combat has gotten better, Square Enix has learned a lot. So, there's a lot of things Final Fantasy III does right that sets staples for the series, but I mean, if we're taking a look at a whole, it just doesn't really fit in any of those other tiers. You know what, I'm going to move this up to B tier. I feel like that is a good placement for it, the more and more I talk about it, because like I said, it really set the staples of a lot of what I've put in S tier and A tier. Without this game, I don't think Final Fantasy would be the series that it is today. Speaking of another controversial Final Fantasy title, let's talk about Final Fantasy II. This is going to be put into... I'm going to put this in C tier. For one reason. The only thing that's halting this from going into D tier, because let's talk about that first. Its combat feels great. Its leveling system does not. I get the concepts that Square Enix were going for with its leveling system. I get that Square Enix wanted to try and innovate its leveling system, but it just falls apart. And that is part of the reason the game is hated so much by the community. There were some great concepts with the leveling, it just wasn't executed the best. For those of you who don't know how it works, in order to increase your HP and your defense, you have to take attacks. In order to increase magic, you have to use magic. Build up your efficiency with a certain weapon, you have to use that certain weapon. Like, it looks great on paper, but its execution made it very difficult. On the other hand, Final Fantasy II has a really good story, especially for its time. It's not as great as some of the other Final Fantasy stories, but again, for a product of its time and the story that it was able to tell, it is a very solid entry. There's also a lot of, I will say, risks that Final Fantasy II took with its characters, without spoiling anything, that make this game stand out above a lot of the earlier entries. Even Final Fantasy IV, for that matter, didn't have the impact with some of its characters that Final Fantasy II did when it came to certain scenes. Again, I don't want to spoil the game for those interested in playing it, but this is a title I'm looking forward to reviewing, if nothing else, to talk a little bit more in depth about some things I liked about its story. Final Fantasy IV is not my favorite Final Fantasy. I have a hard time placing this because there are elements to Final Fantasy IV I really enjoyed. The opening cinematic, not really cinematic, but the opening scene is one of my favorite moments from Final Fantasy, as is going to Mount Ordeal and Cecil as a character. Cecil is a very compelling main character, and one of my favorites, actually, when it comes to the main characters from the series. There's also other elements of its story that I did like. I kind of liked, again, how in the opening you kind of started as the bad guy. You're doing all these horrible things, and then the rest of the game is kind of Cecil questioning, what am I supposed to do? In a way, his character arc was kind of reused with Beatrix in Final Fantasy IX. So there's a lot of respect for Cecil in that regard. This is a game, though, that, again, its story has been topped, but it really set the staples for where the series was going. I am going to put this in B tier. A very, 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 very high B tier. The only reason I'm not putting this in A tier is because I feel like other stories have come along and done a much better, I don't say much better, but a much, that they've modernized more, and the stories have become more complex. But without Final Fantasy IV, I don't think the series would be where it is today, especially when it comes to the early ATB systems. There's also some of the characters in Final Fantasy IV I just didn't care much for. And I kind of didn't like how you only had just 5 specific party members you used towards the end, rather than kind of having a group that you could choose from. Let's talk about the game everybody loves next, Final Fantasy VII. Do I need to tell you where I'm putting this one? Do I need to tell you why? Final Fantasy VII's S tier. Hands down, an absolutely amazing experience. Final Fantasy VII has one of, if not my favorite story within the franchise. I love its characters. I love its story. I love its world building. I love its lore. I love its combat. I love its leveling system, its materia system. It is an absolutely amazing game. And let's face it, Final Fantasy VII didn't exist. I don't think Japanese RPGs would be near as popular as they are today. Square Enix wouldn't be a household name. The Final Fantasy franchise wouldn't be where it was. You wouldn't have other companies realizing that people wanted to play Japanese RPGs. Final Fantasy VII really cemented the legacy of Japanese studios and the popularity of the Japanese RPG genre in the West. Absolutely amazing game. Another one of my favorite games up next is Final Fantasy VI. This is also an S tier for me. Its characters, its story, world building, villains, concepts. It's such an amazing game. It's very, very dark in certain areas, and I enjoyed its plot for that reason. Final Fantasy VI is an experience like no other. I have yet to really experience another Final Fantasy that has made me so connected to the characters like this one did. Again, there's some side characters later on you get that are kind of just meh, but that main cast of characters was so well written. There's a lot of passion that went into this game, and it clearly shows. The music is also really fantastic. I think if we're talking on a level of my favorite soundtrack, it's not up there. It's maybe in my top 5, but Final Fantasy IX and 8 will always hold that special place in my heart for soundtrack. Final Fantasy X also comes really, really close, but Final Fantasy VI's music is also very well done. There's a lot that I love about this game, and it is a game I continually find myself thinking about. So, the only 2 Final Fantasies I have yet to really, really beat are 2. Final Fantasy II and Final Fantasy V. Final Fantasy V, right now, I am placing in... I'm going to put this in B tier. I feel like that this could either go up or down, and I kind of feel like it might stay in B tier possibly as well. But when I do finally get around to reviewing Final Fantasy V, I will kind of let you guys know towards the end of that video where I would place this on a tier list. Would it go up? Would it go down? Would it stay? But from what I have played, there are elements to it that I really, really enjoyed. There are a lot of great moments within the game, and I do like the characters quite a bit, so there's that to be said. Oh, Final Fantasy. The very first Final Fantasy. You know what? I'm going to place this, and this might shock many of you. I'm going to place this in A tier. Final Fantasy would not exist without the original Final Fantasy. Had it not been for that team at Square Enix putting all of their assets into making this game and making it a success and a hit, we wouldn't have a Final Fantasy franchise to even be talking about today. So needless to say, the legacy that this game left behind was pretty substantial. That being said, I know I've talked a great deal about how other games in the series have come along and really expanded on certain... well, let's move this down to B tier. But I feel like because of this, Final Fantasy I's existence helped propel the series forward. There's been other games that have come along and done things a lot better. But for an initial first story of what Final Fantasy was going for, it was there. There was a lot of interesting world building. The leveling system, the early moments of that game, the concepts that game brought to the plate, it really formed what the franchise has been today. And it would set the job system that so many other games would use moving forward within the franchise. So a lot of appreciation goes into Final Fantasy for that, and I do love this game. It comes from a nostalgic standpoint, playing it with a friend again, going through and creating entire backstories for our four main protagonists and how they all ended up in Cornelia at some point, or Cornelia, sorry, not Cornelia, Cornelia Castle, to meet the king and become the Warriors of Light. So, absolutely love the game, and I'm looking forward to reviewing that one, but not as much as I am some of the other games in the franchise. Final Fantasy 13 2. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. This is a difficult one for me to place. Character-wise, I do like Sarah and Null. Character-wise, I do like Lightning and Caius. I think Caius is actually one of my favorite Final Fantasy villains. And the reasonings he did for what he did were actually very, very interesting. And it really fleshed out Caius as a character a lot more. I didn't like how they handled Snow. Snow was one of my favorite characters in Final Fantasy XIII and just kind of ended up being more annoying in this game. Its battle system was really good. I did like the concept of using enemies to fight. It addressed the linearity that Final Fantasy XIII had, and then it kind of screwed up with the ending. I'll get more into that with Lightning Returns when we talk about that next, but I'm going to place this in B tier. B tier. There's a lot of things it does right from Final Fantasy XIII, but then there's a lot of things that it does really, really wrong with Final Fantasy XIII. It felt like for every step it took forward, it took one step back. So there's a lot of issues that I have with it, but I did enjoy it at the same time. It's a hard placement to make. It's definitely a better game in a lot of ways than Final Fantasy XIII was, because it addressed a lot of problems that people, myself included, had with Final Fantasy XIII, but I can't say I enjoyed it more than Final Fantasy XIII either. It's a very complicated game to place. Lightning Returns, this is a D tier. D tier, horrible story, horrible characters. It did a disservice to all of the characters within the Final Fantasy XIII world. Did not enjoy them in the slightest. I hated how they handled lightning. I hated how they handled hope. I hated how they handled snow. I hated how they handled pretty much everybody, even Null. It's like a completely different team was writing this game and said, you know what, let's make everybody depressed, complete shells of their former selves, and maybe for a plot reason they were going for that, but I just couldn't buy it. And couple that with the shit writing, the terrible... I didn't like the combat system. I'm not going to lie. I know people sit there and say that this is the best within the 13 franchise. I would disagree. I think Final Fantasy 13 really nailed its combat, and Lightning Returns just kind of tried to incorporate Final Fantasy X-2 meets Final Fantasy 13, but let's make its battle system slightly different to focus on one character. Throw in the time mechanics, having to constantly stop time. It was just a slog to get through. Not a recommended title. Am I going to review this title? I don't know. We'll hit that roadblock sometime on this channel, but Final Fantasy 13, not for me. Didn't like it in the slightest. Let's talk Final Fantasy Tactics. Final Fantasy Tactics, this is another extremely difficult game for me to place, because there's a lot about this title that I truly enjoy. It's got a rather unique combat system, especially when it comes to other Final Fantasies. This tried to go more of a tactics ogre, if you will, strategy-based battle system. It was very well done. The class system worked very well. There's actually a lot of ways that you can cheese the combat as well and make your characters very overpowered, depending on how you place your characters and how you level them up. The story is absolutely amazing. There is so much I love about this game's story. Again, it goes back into the same reasons that I love Final Fantasy XII. It's dark, it's gritty, there's a lot of betrayal, a lot of death, a lot of dark themes that are explored within this franchise. Mayumi Matsuno did an excellent job in crafting the story. There's a reason his stories in Final Fantasy, or just in general, his stories stand out so much. He is really great at being able to tell narratives. And Tactics was really the first time that people got on a grand level to be able to experience that. However, there is a couple problems I have with the writing. I don't like how it handled some of its characters, and I will explain. Its characters are really great, but it feels like once those characters joined your party, they were just kind of forgotten about. They never really got a chance to shine or have their own story, despite them feeling like they were written of importance into the story. Characters such as Orlando and Agreus come to mind. Once they kind of join your party, they're just kind of forgotten about and are there, and then just become another mercenary, almost, if you will, that you could have just recruited. And it's a shame, because I did like these characters, especially when they had a bigger role within the game. That is the one thing that holds this game back. That is the one reason I feel I have to put this in A tier. There is so much this game does right. So much I loved about this game, but because of that one problem, I can't put this in S tier. I can't put this as one of the top Final Fantasy games, despite it nailing it in every other category. Had they just... And I get why they did it, because of the permadeath, but in a way I feel like the permadeath hurt that system quite a bit. I felt like that permadeath hurt the character development that they could have done. There are some other characters I would have liked to seen flesh out more, and I get this was about Ramza's story, and specifically about Ramza, but it's just the other characters felt like they were written in there far too much to just be ignored like they were. And that leaves us with one other game, World of Final Fantasy. If you were to have told me when this game was released at Final Fantasy, next to Final Fantasy 15, and I would enjoy, or was it's Final Fantasy 7 Remake actually, but I would have enjoyed this game much more than I did Final Fantasy 15, I wouldn't have believed you. But truth be told, I did. This game was absolutely awesome. It's very childish. It's very Pokemon-esque. Its story in a way is very melodramatic, but it all works in the context of what the game was going for. I loved that turn-based feel. I loved the classic homage to Final Fantasies. I loved how it paid so much fan service to all of the Final Fantasy games. Being able to see all these characters, yet again, come together in one game was absolutely cool. It's kind of the game that I always want to see happen, and here we are talking about it, and how they were able to incorporate all of these different worlds into one Final Fantasy world was so cool. It was an awesome game. One of the most underrated games from this generation. A tier. Awesome game. I say if you're a fan of Final Fantasy, temper your expectations and just go in and have fun with it. It's childish, it's melodramatic, it's over the top, but that's what gives this game a certain charm. Absolutely great game, and that's my Final Fantasy tier placement. Overall, taking a look at it, Final Fantasy is a very solid experience. There are a lot of titles that do really, really well. And, I mean, taking a look at some of these, I would say, for products of their time, you could easily put 3, 4, and 5 up in A tier or S tier interchangeably. Same with Final Fantasy 1. And, I mean, you've got a series that just overall has a lot of quality titles. Modern Square Enix, as the list kind of shows, is very divisive for me. There are elements I do like from certain games, and there's others that I don't. But, I mean, taking a look at it, I'm very satisfied with the way that this list looks. Again, maybe reviewing some of these games and going back and replaying them, I might find that I appreciate them more or less, so this tier list could change. But I kind of doubt that as well, because some of these things I can overlook for nostalgia's sake, and when I do my reviews, I will go in and look at some of these elements with a more critical eye. I won't let nostalgia blind me, but, you know, at the same time, very satisfied with the way that this list turned out. Again, I think it's going to be very different for everybody who plays this. Some people might end up placing 3, 4, and 5 a lot higher than I did. A lot lower maybe, but it depends on that. But I really think when it came to the first 10 titles, Square Enix were in the top of their game, and this really reflects that. It really shows, you know, how great Squaresoft was back in the day, and, you know, how much influence the Final Fantasy franchise had. So I'm going to leave this down below in the description. You guys are more than welcome to go through and make a tier list based on this yourself. Upload a video, you know, about it. Do a video response. Have some fun. I would like to see this placement of this. This will be kicking off a month-long thing I am going to be doing for the channel. I want to try to get 3, 4 videos uploaded of just kind of strictly talking about Final Fantasy. Next, I think we're going to be taking a look at some of the best Final Fantasy villains and kind of going from there. But we'll see what happens if I can stay up to the schedule, because we are getting into some busy times at work. But that being said, guys, be sure to hit subscribe. Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, all those links down below in the description box. If you guys want to see Legend of Legaia streamed live, be sure to come over to my Twitch channel and check that out. If at any point you want to purchase any of these Final Fantasy games, I will leave some links down below in the description. The ones that you can buy off of Amazon. Just know that when you click on those links, they are affiliate links, meaning that I do get a little bit of kickback from that, a little bit of commission from Amazon for you making that purchase. All of that will go to helping make all of that will go to helping build the channel and pumping it back into the channel so I can continue to make more quality videos. But that being said, guys, thanks again for watching. If you stuck this long, you're an amazing trooper, and let me know down below what your favorite Final Fantasy is. For me, it's Final Fantasy, as I already stated. I love so much about that game. But I'm not going to waste any more of your time. Most importantly, stay happy, be happy, game happy. Spoons is checking out.